Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone across the globe joining us today. This is Bridget from Acquia. Today's webinar is 100 Sites, a Mixed Drupal Platform, One Federated Search Solution with Ken Rickard from Palantir.net and Maggie Schroeder from Acquia. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any audio issues, please send them in the Q&A tab and I will assist you. If you have any questions for the presenters, please submit them in the Q&A tab as well, and they will answer them at the end of the presentation. Slides and the recording of this webinar will be posted to acquia.com and also sent to you via email within the next few days. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Ken.
Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. I'm Ken Rickard. I'm the Senior Director of Consulting at Palantir.net. I've been working in the Drupal space for, 14 years now. I've been working on the web for 22, and I will pass to Maggie to introduce herself.
Sure, thanks, Ken. Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie Schroeder. I'm a product marketing manager at Acquia, and I actually focus on our core products of what we're calling our Drupal cloud. So that encompasses Acquia Cloud, Site Factory, Cohesion, Edge, and a few others as well that you might have heard of. So happy to be on the webinar with you all today. And Ken, if you'll go to the next slide. Awesome. So for everyone in the audience today, we have a poll just to get a feel for who's really out there so we can tailor the conversation that we're going to have on the webinar today to you. So our first question is, what version or versions of Drupal are you currently running today? And feel free to select multiple answers. If you've got some Drupal 7, some Drupal 8 sites, we want to include, again, all answers in this poll. So we'll hold this for another 10 seconds just to give everyone an opportunity to cast their votes. All right, and it looks like they're slowing down. So it looks like we've got a lot of you on Drupal 8 today, and that's awesome. Good to hear that those migrations from Drupal 7 are going well. And we do still have, a very dominant Drupal 7 crowd as well. And since there's some overlap, it looks like there's still some people who are in the process of migration. So that's awesome. So now we have a second poll. Ken, if you'll switch to the next slide. And we want to hear, how many Drupal applications are you running today? Do you have 1, 2 to 5? Maybe you have many. Again, would love to hear your answers about, where you're at with your Drupal apps. Great, we'll give it another couple seconds to get all of the poll voting in from our contestants. Just another couple seconds. We still have a couple votes trickling in. Awesome. So displaying on the screen right now is what the landscape looks like. It looks like the majority of you fit into the 5 to 20 sites. However, we do have some on the phone having 1, maybe 2 to 5. And then we also have a couple in the 100+ range and in that upper range of 50 to 100. So very diverse crowd out there. Great to see. Cool, so thank you all for participating in our polls today. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Ken with your premier webinar event today.
All right, thank you, Maggie. So I'm going to run through today's agenda and then we'll get right to it. For those of you who don't know, I'm actually sitting in Augusta, Georgia right now, home of the Masters Golf Tournament, and we're going to talk about georgia.gov, which is a state website that is basically the umbrella site for all government activity in the state of Georgia. So this is a project very close to me in my life. We're going to talk about what Georgia needs for search. They do have a network of 85 independent websites that are all running on Drupal. They need a cross-platform experience, and they had a need for easy deployment of search. And we'll talk about this because they're in the process of migrating from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. And I noticed in the poll that our numbers added up to 145% of us are using Drupal 7 and 8 combined, which means a lot of you, I think, are in the same position. After we talk about what Georgia needs, I'm actually going to do a little bit of a technical dive and talk about how the federated search product actually works, talk about where it came from, and the 3 main components of it. This will not be a technical how-to. It'll just be enough information for you to go back to your teams and say, hey, here's how we get this thing running. And then we'll talk very briefly about starting and planning your project. Like, what do you need to get started? What kind of project plan do you need to put in place? And I have some technical questions and considerations that you're going to want to take back to your teams when you start planning things out. And then that will hand back to Maggie because she can talk about exactly how Acquia can help you with that. And then when we're done with all that, we're going to do a little question and answer period. So let's start with the state of Georgia. As I said, I'm a Georgia resident. I actually have to interact with these folks quite frequently. This is their existing Drupal 7, what they call portal site. It is georgia.gov. It is meant to be the entry point for all interactions with the state, with find an agency. And much like a lot of state governments now and a lot of municipalities as well, I mean, search is front and center. It's actually the only thing on the homepage except for some very high level links of common activities. So the challenge that they have is last year and this year, they're in the midst of transforming from their old Drupal 7 platform, which again, 85 websites running on Drupal 7 in the Acquia cloud. And this is an example of one of their sites in Georgia Bureau of Investigation. And they're moving to Drupal 8 and they're redesigning everything. So in the Drupal 7 world, they had their search needs met because there is a series of modules in Drupal that allow you to search multiple Drupal 7 sites at the same time. That's a very simple problem to solve. It's been solved for a couple of years, in fact. The challenge that they had is that they're going to be launching the Drupal 8 sites sort of one at a time over a period of about 15 months. And they wanted to make sure that their global search stayed accurate. So that meant they needed to index content from Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 at the same time into a single search index. And aside from that, we want to talk about what they were after in their experience. So when you go in and do a search on georgia.gov, they wanted to be able to search across the entire network. They wanted to be able to show you exactly where the information was coming from. And when we click on one of those articles, the search result has to take you to the proper website. All right, so this is, again, pretty standard Google style searching where you're searching across an entire collection and then taking people to the most relevant thing, the most relevant context for what they're trying to accomplish. In the search result interface, they want people to be able to, search by keyword, obviously, but then narrow down, drill down based on, well, what's the source? Because you might know you're looking for equal opportunity legislation information, and the Department of Labor may be most relevant to you. It may be more important with the Department of Banking and Finance, et cetera, et cetera. So being able to filter in becomes really, really critical for them. So when you actually use the filters, it automatically reloads your search results and lets you drill in to get the more accurate listings that you're looking for. Then you can also drill down by type of content. So they have, documents, they have press releases, et cetera, et cetera. So what that lets them do, again, is funnel people to the right information. The added challenge is that for the state of Georgia, they also had an existing autocomplete search function. So if you were on a specific website, they want to be able to say, oh, you're typing in the search box, here's what you're going to get for results, right? And we can talk about this a little bit later in the Q&A, but they have a specific application that handles this autocomplete functionality. And so we can talk about how we integrated that. So we've got basic search, we've got autocomplete, and then you'll notice it's a little hard to memorize from 4 slides ago, but the search results on the Department of Human Services are very, very similar. I mean, the layout is identical, but one thing that you may or may not notice on first look is when we drill in and look at the filter results over on the left, the site name choice is gone. And that's because the requirement from the state of Georgia is When I'm on georgia.gov, I want to search everyone in the entire network. But when I'm on an individual website, I only want to search the content from that website. In practicality, what that means from the application level is when you configure this across, say, a network of 100 sites, you can configure a site to search all of 100. You can configure a site to search 10 of them. You can configure a site to search only itself. That is built into the application and a really nice feature. So that might mean in the case of Georgia, if they have a cluster of sites that are all about, say, consumer protection. And so you might need, these 5 sites are relevant in that context. They can actually set it up such that only those 5 sites are searchable from within that site context. So here we have the same search run on a different site, and you get different results. That's all I'm really trying to show. And again, they get filtering, et cetera, et cetera. So we get a consistent result. We get consistent performance. And what's nice as a user of the website, one of the things that the state of Georgia has really concentrated on in the Drupal 8 series, you'll notice in the upper black bar on the screen, it says, this is an official website of the state of Georgia government, and here's how you can tell. They're really, really concerned about consistent branding so that people understand that they're interacting with the proper authority on these things. And so having a consistent look and feel to all their search results is actually really helpful from that perspective. One last little piece, we also have date filtering baked in. And this date filtering can be really, really helpful. And it'll show you, for example, let's see just things published in the last 6 months, and there's a date picker, and that's really nice. So to summarize, what did Georgia actually need? They needed, again, to be able to search this network of 100 websites, or 85 websites, pardon me, across both Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. They needed to be able to limit searches on a site-by-site basis or search everything. They needed to have a cross-platform experience that had the same search features across their sites. They needed autocomplete on their search boxes, and they needed filtered search results when people landed on the results page. The other piece that they needed was an easy deployment. They wanted something that was configured in a standard way, and for the technical people on the project, they wanted it to just be installed as part of deployment. And so on the Drupal 8 side, we configured this once, and it's part of their build process. So when they deploy a new website, it automatically connects into this search network. When we retrofitted the Drupal 7 stuff, that took a little more work, but it's perfectly supported and easy. So they're able to roll that out as part of their site factory deployments as they spin sites up in Drupal 8. So that's the summary of what Georgia needed. And now I'm going to take a step back and talk about how the application actually works. And this is where you can start thinking about planning this for your organization. So when we look at how things work, we actually started this project in collaboration with the University of Michigan School of Medicine. They came to us a couple of years back and said, hey, we've got some Drupal 7 sites and we're launching some Drupal 8 sites. And we'd love to be able to search across those things. What's interesting about the Michigan case is in the case of Georgia, they're using what Drupal calls an installation profile. So they have common architecture. All of their sites have the same content types. They have the same taxonomy terms. They have what we would call a uniform architecture to things. So that makes mapping the search data much easier. In the case of Michigan Medicine, they don't have common architecture. They have different content types on different sites. They have different names for things in their taxonomy. And so their search problem is actually a little bit more difficult. And from a programming standpoint, it's actually good that they came to us with the harder problem. So we looked through how we wanted to solve this problem, and we came up with a 3-part solution. We'll talk about each of these 3 parts in turn. We have Apache SOLR, which is a search application. And again, for those of you who are Acquia customers, Acquia Search is Apache SOLR. We use React, which is a JavaScript front end, and I'll talk about why we picked that. And then we use Drupal. So if we take those in turn, the key to how all of this works from a SOLR perspective is that SOLR simply expects that you have what they call a uniform schema, which simply means you're indexing the same data for each of your sources. And an index, interestingly enough, can have multiple data sources, right? The reason multi-site search works in Drupal 7 is that's pretty easy to set up when you're using the same version of the software. The challenge that we had to deal with is, well, Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 think about things in a different way. So the first thing we had to do was come up with what's the actual schema? What data are we putting into SOLR so that we can have a uniform experience? And it actually turns out to be fairly simple. We have a title, we have a date, we have a content type, we have taxonomy terms, we have a preview image, we have the actual text of the item, and then we have the link and the name of the site. And this is all we require. So it's pretty straightforward and turns out to be the key. Here's my lovely, most technical slide on here. SOLR knows how to return what are called JSON object or JavaScript object notation objects in response to a search request. JSON is a default standard for delivering data across applications, and that allows us to build a decoupled search application very, very easily. And what that decoupling means is that the search application that you see in Georgia and in Michigan medicine are not actually generated by Drupal itself. It's coming from a JavaScript application. And so we'll see how that works here in a second. So SOLR, it turns out, is actually a very good way to handle this problem because it understands the concept of indexing that we're trying to do, and it can push the data back to us in the way that we want. We use React largely because we found an existing library for it, but React applications really love JSON. That's one of the things that they do. And React is one of the libraries that gets you a sort of desktop-like experience on the web. So in our application, when you click on a filter, the page doesn't actually reload. The React JavaScript library just rewrites the page on demand. So it's a very, very responsive, very immediate application. So in this case, when we started doing our initial research, we found an existing project called SOLR Faceted Search React. Really interesting. This is actually a screenshot of what it looked like when we found it. The existing library had a lot of the good technical pieces that we wanted, but it didn't have the design part. But because we're dealing with open source software, right? Open source, which means that we wrote it once and then we released it so that other people can use it. The library that we found isn't restricted in its use. So we were able to take it, make our own version of it, make the modifications we needed to, and then use it in our application. So this is one of the virtuous elements of working in open source software all the time, because this project literally shaved 3 months off of our build time because we didn't have to reinvent it. So the next piece we actually went through, we were really, really fortunate, I think, to be able to take this time and do it correctly. We did some usability and accessibility testing around search pages, search components, and how people use them. So we wanted to be clear that we could create an application that would serve 90 to 95% of use cases. So we actually had our user experience team go in and do some study and do some analysis. And we also make really clear in the code level and in our expectations that it's also accessible. I remember we actually spent, I think, 2 or 3 days finding a keyboard accessible date picker so that we could make sure that everyone who needed to use the website could. So React is a good solution for us. That's baked in. And now I'll talk about how the Drupal parts work. Drupal provides indexing mechanisms, that is simply pushing content into SOLR, a search page, what we call callback, which is again what you see, and then a search box. These are all provided by a module that we wrote that integrates the React application directly to Drupal 7 or to Drupal 8. It uses the Search API and Search API SOLR modules for both Drupal 8 and Drupal 7. So if you're using SOLR or Acquia Search now, this will look very, very familiar to you because it's the exact same underlying technology or underlying module suite that you're already using. So the most interesting part here, and I'm speaking as sort of a product owner, the part that I'm proudest of the development team on is this part, this field mapping. So we said that for the application to work, we have to have these standard fields indexed into data, into SOLR. The challenge being, well, what if the content structures are different on different websites, or even if they're different on different content types, right? On Palantir.net, on our own website, I mean, Drupal always stores a publication date, which is when a piece of content went live. We have a manual date that we use as the published date. And so if we're indexing a date published through search, do we want to use the auto-generated date, or do we want to use the date that was entered by a person? And this lets us do that. So for each element of these fields, for each type of content that you're indexing, you can either put in a string that says, hey, this is what I want you to call it. You'll notice here, we have, field data for content type page is just listed as general. And that's because not all sites in this network have pages, right? Or they're called something else. So we're able to make sure that everything's called the same, named the same, so that we get a consistent interface across the application. And again, for those of you who are familiar with Drupal development a little bit, we also allow you to use tokens here. And this is what I was just talking about. Node created, that is an auto-generated timestamp, but field published date is selected by our editors. And so we have this level of control to things, which makes the application run. Preview images work in much the same way. We actually provide an image derivative, essentially an image filter that lets you pre-format the images the way we would like them. But we support custom fields and multiple media types. So we actually do have little video previews in some cases, which is really nice. The other thing that I will point out that I really like that Georgia doesn't use, but Michigan does, is taxonomy terms. So you have the ability to add multiple taxonomy terms into your search filters. What's really, really interesting about this, and it's something you'd want to start planning for, is in a lot of cases, people don't use the same terminology across their websites. You might call it dermatology on one site and skincare on another site. How do you handle that problem? Well, what the application lets you do is map taxonomy terms into a standard system so that the SOLR index recognizes that even though you've got different terms for things on different websites, they all mean the same thing. So this is really, really powerful stuff. So there's the last bit to our sort of three-part piece. We've got SOLR, we've got React, and we've got Drupal. Now I'm going to tell you a dirty little secret. The Drupal part is actually not a hard requirement for this application. The SOLR and React parts actually work perfectly fine on their own. You could actually spin up search.georgia.gov that was just the React application. It doesn't need Drupal to power it at all. What we use Drupal for is for standardizing the data, and that's because it's what we're using for publishing in most of these cases. But there's nothing stopping us from indexing content from WordPress or indexing content from a custom application. As long as you can hit the SOLR schema, you can add those sites into your search index, which is really, really, really powerful. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about planning for your project. Like I said, this is all done with open source components. Again, this is a slide you'll want to take back to some of your technical team. There's a demo box that we built, just like a lot of applications like Acquia Dev Desktop. You can actually download our software and it will run a demo for you. We support Mac OS because that's what we use at Palantir. These are the components that you need. It uses Vagrant and a couple of other things. We don't need to spend too much time on it. There are some required elements if you want to install it on your own sites. In the Drupal space, the big module is called Search API Federated SOLR. You can download that and install it at your leisure. And then the piece that does the token and string mapping is called Search API Field Map. That functionality exists in the Drupal 7 version of Search API Federated SOLR, but in Drupal 8, it's actually a standalone module because it might have use outside our use case. So we released it as a separate project. We're in the process, I should point out, of doing a 3.x release. The stable and supported version right now is the 2.x that runs on Apache Solr versions 4.5, which is what Acquia Search is mostly running, up to 6.3, which is what Michigan is running. And then Apache Solr versions 7 and higher are going to be covered by a 3x version, which should be released within the next week. So I want to put a little timeline in front of you. As I said, I've been doing this for a very long time, and I end up doing a lot of project management as a sort of sideline. And one of the things that you'll want to go through is a sort of 4-step process. And the first piece is really looking at your content model, right? How do you want to represent your content through the search application? Do you need to use taxonomies? Do you need to map those taxonomies onto one another? Georgia, for instance, decided that the taxonomy problem in Drupal 7 was too complicated for them to even try to solve. So they just left it out, which is perfectly fine. So you'll want to dive into your content model and then use that to inform how you do the configuration. Once you do the configuration, you would go into a testing phase, and then you do a deployment. And once you deploy, of course, it'll be live. And then you repeat that as needed. And again, one of the things we can talk about with Acquia is how do we make that process easy and repeatable? So the technical considerations, and again, I would encourage you to take this back to your team. Things you need to start thinking about right now is, are my sites the same, right? Are they running on the same Drupal version? Are there other sources that I need to index? Do they have the same content model? Do they have the same taxonomies? And then what sites should I search from each context? Should I search all sites? Should I search one site? Should I search a cluster of similar? And then you have to get into this bigger question of how will I launch new sites? Right. In Drupal 8, we have configuration management, which makes this process pretty seamless. But there are installation profiles and a couple of other ways to do it. So that's the sort of broad scope of what we're trying to accomplish. The other thing that I would point out here is because we have this really nicely researched and designed search interface, there's nothing stopping those of you who just have one Drupal site from using this. You can drop it in and use it, and it'll be just fine because you do get a really nice, very responsive, interactive search application. So even if you're in that small slice of people who have one site to manage, it's perfectly appropriate product for you. And for those of you who have 100 or more sites, it's going to be really, really key. So with that, I'm going to pass this back to the folks at Acquia so they can talk about how you might deploy on the cloud.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ken. So I saw that we do have a lot of people on the call today who are familiar with Drupal, and it also looks like a bunch of you are in process of migrating from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. So I guess to take it back a step from Drupal. For those of you who don't know Acquia, we are the open source digital experience company. So what do I mean when I say that? Well, our roots are come from Drupal. And so again, I know that most of you on the call today are familiar with Drupal. And our founder at Acquia actually is Dries Butart, who is also the founder and leader of the Drupal open source project. So let's come back though to Drupal. So Acquia has been in business for 11 years. And the reason that Dries founded Acquia was because, where he founded Drupal, he realized that developers needed a place and businesses needed a place where they could run their Drupal application and more so than run, refocus on their application rather than the maintenance of the infrastructure that ultimately supports that application. And that's really where Drupal Cloud, or Acquia Cloud rather, came to be. And so today on Acquia Cloud, as well as Acquia Cloud Site Factory, which enables customers to create sites at scale, we have thousands of customers and some of the most successful brands in the world. And while we have those customers, we also have a plethora of customers in the small and mid-market range as well, because we support any Drupal application that you want to run on Acquia. And recently, if you haven't seen the news from Acquia, we were named a leader in digital experience platforms. And so digital experience is a fun way of really talking about the end-to-end user experience from website to email delivery to understanding customer data. And so if you haven't seen that report, definitely a good one to check out. So Ken, if you'll actually switch over to the next slide. So of course, I briefly talked about some of the products on the Drupal cloud side. And this is really where, the state of Georgia, Ken spent a lot of time speaking to, how they really executed on the search side. So the state of Georgia is actually a very successful Drupal cloud. So that's encompasses Acquia Cloud, Site Factory, Cohesion, Edge, et cetera, all the ones you see on the slide here. They're a successful Acquia Cloud customer. And the Georgia team actually built out a multi-site architecture, and their goal was to promote consistency and flexibility across all of their agency sites on Acquia Cloud. And Ken mentioned they do have a bunch of sites, and they leverage Drupal today. And with Acquia Cloud, they were actually able to migrate content efficiently, and they ended up creating a custom responsive mobile-first search application by leveraging the capabilities in Drupal. And so ultimately, in the end, I know Ken gave you guys a deep dive into how Georgia executed on their search platform. They were also able to, in 12 months, launch 55 sites on the Acquia platform. And they also realized around $4.7 million worth of savings by executing this migration to Drupal and Acquia Cloud. So there's really a lot of potential here, and that's just speaking to our cloud product. But I also mentioned that we are a digital experience company based on, of course, delivering Drupal applications. So you can see that gives a gateway into the Marketing Cloud, which also provides personalization from Lyft. Our newest acquisition, Agile One, providing a CDP platform for additional insight into your customers' data, Mautic for delivering content across different channels and also orchestrating those, Maestro doing that across multiple brands, and then of course Acquia's DAM as well, so Digital Asset Manager. So really our goal here by delivering all of this whole platform, right, is that you don't have to purchase just one. That's the benefit of Acquia, or rather, you don't have to purchase the whole suite. You can choose how you want to leverage Acquia's products to deliver solutions that are right for you. And I think Ken walked through a great use case today of how Georgia was able to leverage Acquia Cloud, as well as Drupal and the Federated search platform to deliver the experience that they needed to serve their business needs. And so with that, I'll pass it back over to Bridget because we have a couple questions that have been coming in that we've been collecting. And of course, feel free if you have any questions on the phone. We do have quite a few coming in, but please pop those into the Q&A if you have any outstanding questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maggie and Ken. All right, first question. How do we start mapping our taxonomies for use with federated search?
Yeah, this is a classic question, and the simple answer is you start firing up spreadsheets. So the question with taxonomy becomes whether or not you're using a uniform system. If you are, it's very straightforward because you can just do it as a one-to-one. If you're not using a common taxonomy, what you need to do is go in and decide what your commonalities are going to be. And you would write your new common taxonomy in one column of your spreadsheet, and then fill in for each site how do your existing taxonomy terms map to those things. In the demo site, we just rewrote it. It's all dog related because I'm a dog owner. And so in the demo site, for example, we have a category for color. And so dogs can be a specific color, but on site A, we call them yellow, and on site B, we call them gold. But those two things are mapped as gold in the search index. So that's a good example, a very simple example of how you do it. But you start the way you start any content modeling process by finding out what you want your sort of ideal state to be, and then mapping your existing state to it. And there are a lot of good open schemas available. Schema.org, for example, is a very good example of where you could get started.
Okay, great. We have one question that came in, and Ken, you might have to dissect this a little bit. How do you go about adding autocomplete to SOLR-based site search versus views-based search?
That's a great question. So how do you do autocomplete using SOLR-based site search or views? So the application itself provides autocomplete with it. If you actually go and look in the Drupal module, there's an autocomplete JavaScript file that just handles it. So we have an autocomplete search handler that's baked into the search results page and to the search block that we provide. What's interesting, however, and this is a modification we made specifically for the state of Georgia, for the search block, such as you might see on the home page or in the header, you can either use the direct connection to SOLR that we provide, or you can input any URL you would like, including the URL to a view. There's some information in the module that tells you construct a view that outputs data in this format, and then you can plug in any logic you like to the autocomplete.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right, next question. Can we index and search content from other sources, other than Drupal?
You certainly can. Again, the key here becomes, can the content provider, the CMS you're using, index things using the schema that we've provided? And again, so you have to be able to provide federated title, and you have to be able to provide the rendered item. Those fields are required. So anything that you can make hit that schema will work. All right, we do most of our work in Drupal. That's where we focus our efforts, but it wouldn't be that complicated to take any other CMS that knows how to index to SOLR and teach it how to do this as well.
Okay, we'll do two more questions. What plans are there to support Drupal 9?
So the Drupal 9 plan is part of the 3.x release that I said was coming next week. For those of you who are not familiar, the big thing for Drupal 9 is there are not the underlying data model changes that you normally see from a Drupal 7 to 8 migration. So you won't have to do a content migration. It's really a code level issue. So the only thing we have to do for Drupal 9 is make sure that we're not using code that has been removed from the code base. And there are some automated tools for doing that There's some testing tools. There's another project that we're actually supporting over at Palantir.net called Rector. Rector is an automated code updating tool that is common in the PHP community and that we're adapting for Drupal 9 use. So the Drupal 9 plan is simply, once we get the stable 3.x release out, probably the 3.1 release will be Drupal 9 compatible. So it's just going to be a case of going through, checking our code, checking it twice, and making those updates. And that should be seamless to people using the application.
Awesome. All right, one more question. What versions of SOLR are supported?
Right. So this is where things do get a little bit interesting. For those of you who are using Acquia Search right now, Acquia Search for most customers uses SOLR 4.5. So that's where most of our support has been. The stable release that's out right now targets Acquia Search and 4.5, but will work with versions of SOLR up to SOLR 6. The Michigan site that I showed you is actually using 6.3, so that's perfectly fine. The 3.x release that's coming provides support for SOLR 7 and SOLR 8. So there will be a breakpoint coming where if you're using the existing module and you're staying on an older version of SOLR, you'll want to stay on that module. But for those of you who are launching on SOLR 7, which Acquia is rolling out this year, you'll want to use the 3.x version. So when we get to Drupal 9 support, it's going to be for SOLR 7. And there's some reasons behind why that is. But if you absolutely have to have Drupal 9 support for SOLR 4, let us know and we can talk about it.
Okay, great. That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much, Ken and Maggie, and thank you all for attending our webinar. As I said previously, the slides and the recording of this webinar will be posted to acquia.com and also sent to you via email within the next few days. And if you have any additional questions, please send them to marketing@theacquiateam.com. Thank you so much and have a great day.